Let me tell you where before they came to Australia, my father and his family lived in Poland, in Shepparton, which is in near Lomshe, near Lomshe, Berna, I think. They went from Poland to Eretz Israel, and that was, I think, in about 1906 or something or other, whenever it was just after the Russian-Japanese War, which I think the Japanese won. They went from Poland to Eretz Israel in about 1906 or something or other, and they were there for possibly almost 4 or 5 years, and I believe they lost a lot of money in Eretz Israel at the time. Now, my father arrived in Australia with his mother and other siblings. We were at the point where I believe that my father had his bar mitzvah on the ship coming from Eretz Israel to Melbourne in the year 1912, and when he was 12 years old. And I think that his father may have come to Australia a year before to see what the thing was, and a year later, my father, his mother, various uncles and aunts arrived with them. Now, I'm not quite sure as to the timing when they started planting the orchards, but there were orchards planted after the end of the First World War, which finished in 1918, and as part of the soldier settlement, the soldiers coming back were given land to plant orchards, etc., etc. And at the same time, that's when the Rosenbaums and the Faglins arrived and also planted the orchards in Shepparton.
What challenges did they face when they arrived in Australia?
Well, they had been given the land through the help of some Jewish benefactor. I can't think, Kronheim or somebody or other, I can't think of the name, but they had to work very hard to produce produce that they could sell in order to make money to live. After the trees had started producing fruit, you know, and after holiday and all that, they made the cases, the wooden cases for the fruit to be picked and sold, and it was sold not only in the area of Shepparton, but I think it was also sent to Melbourne, to places like the Victoria Market and Wholesale Market for sale so that they could make some money.
How did they contribute to the Australian economy?
Well, they did a lot of work, and they founded the canning companies, including the SPC, Shepparton Preserving Company, which preserved the fruit. Now, also I believe that my father also worked for some time at the SPC.
What do you remember about your grandparents in Shepparton?
I was born in Geelong. My parents had a business in Geelong. Mein erste Sprache ist Yiddish. My parents taught me to read and write in Yiddish and also to read and write in English. So that when I was 5, I went straight to state school, which is 5 minutes walk from the house, and went into grade 1. My parents worked very hard in Geelong, and at the end of the year holidays, the summer holidays, we would take a week off and travel by train to Melbourne, and then wait an hour or two and catch the train to Shepparton, and we would arrive in Shepparton about 8 o'clock in the evening after having left Geelong at 8 o'clock in the morning. When the train arrived at 8 p.m. or something in the evening in Shepparton, Uncle Joel would pick us up in his car and drive us to the house of our grandparents. The grandparents' house, which was opposite the shul, was on a big block which had a large orchard already planted on it, and a few minutes walk down the street was the house where my uncle Joel and his wife Auntie Hannah and the kids lived. I think that we only went to Shepparton on holidays possibly 4 or 5 times the most, which means over a period of 4 or 5 years. My grandmother, who was possibly 10 years younger than my grandfather, died 3 or 4 years before my grandfather died, and they were both not alive at the time of my bar mitzvah. I do recall that on one occasion when we were going from Melbourne to Shepparton by train, there was a flood of the Goulburn River there, and people were drowning in the river, and they sent in dogs to help them to escape out of the flood waters. Also, I remember, this is before my grandparents died, that the De Niro boys, the refugees, arrived in Australia and they were imprisoned in Tatura. I do remember about the De Niro boys. They were my grandfather and the Faglins helped to arrange that they were allowed out to work on the orchards, and I remember also that Mr. Lobenstein was allowed to shecht for the Kahila in Shepparton. By some strange coincidence, many years later, I was working in television, and there was a series produced on television called the Danira Boys, and I was in a lot of episodes of that series, and I have the DVD of the series. When my grandparents were alive, I remember going to the shul, which is straight across the road from their house, and at that time they had a hostel there where Jewish people from Melbourne would come to train to go and work in Hachshara, I think, in Israel.
What was the Jewish education like at that time in Australia?
Well, the education, there were no Jewish schools. The education was done in the home by my parents. My father also, when he came to live in Geelong, he used to conduct the service in the shul on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and Reverend Rutsky would come from Melbourne and stay at our house and live with us for over the period of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But all the Jewish education that I received in my first and second years of schooling were by my father and mother. Thank you. Thank you. It's my pleasure, and if you have any more questions about the history of the Geelong community, etc., please feel free to ask. My pleasure. Sei gesund. Koltov.